All right. Our next presenter is Dr. Andrew Pyle, Associate Professor, Department of Communication at Clemson University. Dr. Pyle, take it
Hey,
away.
everyone. Thank you so much. First, I don't have any cool slides like my presenter colleagues have had, so I apologize for that. Also, I'm going to apologize for the construction noise out my window. If you hear it, there will be beeping. But I'm going to talk to you today about a project I got to work on with Clemson's Division of Public Safety and our university police department. In 2019, the Pew Research Center estimated that 72% of adults in the US use some form of social media. If you look only at adults in the 18 to 29 age range, that number goes up to 90%. And for most individuals, this isn't like a gym membership where you show up sometimes and then maybe you don't, and then you still pay for it, but you're not really using it, right? It's something that people are using every day. My students tell me that they're on TikTok sometimes as much as 5 or 6 hours in a day. And in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, that usage increased pretty drastically for a lot of people. And looking at the sort of changing environment of social media in that landscape, police departments are utilizing social media more and more to improve operations, engagement, and investigations. Departments use social media to engage and inform their key publics on ongoing issues, as well as to receive feedback about community issues that need resolution. Social media can also be used to monitor threats in schools, communities, and large events. For example, police in Canada arrested a 16-year-old for using social media to make bomb threats against schools, which is also a common threat in the US. Locally in South Carolina, police have investigated high-profile shootings, such as the Mother Emanuel shooting in 2015 with Dylan Roof, or the Townville Elementary School shooting in 2016. Increases in mass shootings and violent threats of public safety have put law enforcement responders in jeopardy at times. And it also has moved departments to a point where they recognize the value, the importance of looking to social media as a way to detect and prepare and to partner. So in 2019, I served as Clemson's first faculty fellow for public safety, and I worked alongside law enforcement and first responders to track and analyze social media messaging before, during, and after large sporting events. On game days in Clemson, we typically have an additional 150,000 people on campus in a town with a population of about 16,000 and a university population of about 23,000 students. So the size of the population in the area just explodes on game days. Over the course of the football season, we were able to add a layer of support that had never existed before for our public safety entity. My interns and I used both manual tracking of platforms. So Frauke, that was a very familiar feeling, right? Going into all those different platforms to try to find that data. And we also were able to use a social listening platform we were using at the time to engage in these large scale keyword searches. And so we had a system in place, but with so much to look at and so many different platforms, the social listening platforms limitations, there was a lot of manual work to do there as well. And so we were scraping thousands of different sources at some points, listening and looking for potential hazards and threats across these various platforms during these sporting events. During the 2019 football season, we detected several potential hazards at or near the sporting venue, which enabled responders to intercede before a crisis could develop. Since that time, my colleagues in criminal justice and I have been working to develop a system of early detection for potential hazards. So we're currently applying for funding with DOJ and NIJ to build a more extensive project in this area. We got held up by COVID. We applied in COVID, and the feedback was essentially, sporting events aren't happening right now, just wait. And so we're working on reapplying for that funding at this point. And hopefully soon we will have more to share about some of the projects in this area. But it's been a pretty neat opportunity to see how scholars and researchers can partner with first responders to try to prevent potentially devastating events before they occur. So it's been interesting. Thank you for the time today.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Pyle. I can't decide if I call out people by first names or by your titles, so I'll probably go back and forth. Don't feel offended if I mix it up. And I know that you have to run. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, but we have your info in the chat there if anybody wants to send a follow-up email. Thanks so much. All right, next we have Dr. Kelly Helm Smith, Research Assistant Professor at the School of Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Assistant Director of the National Drought Mitigation Center here at UNL as well.
Doesn't look like am I sharing the right screen?
I thought you were. That was looking good.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Slides? Okay. For some reason, I'm not seeing it on the share screen thing. Okay, so what you should be looking at right now is examples of drought-related tweets from the past couple of weeks. They're talking about dust in Kansas and Texas and rain, but not enough rain in California. I work for the National Drought Mitigation Center, which is over on UNL's East Campus. And one of our most visible products is the US Drought Monitor map that comes out every Thursday showing the location and intensity of drought. One of the really interesting things about this map, and part of why it has so much credibility with media and policymakers, is that it's not only based on weather data. The people who make the map synthesize a lot of weather data, but then they work with local experts like state climatologists across the country who can help interpret the data and provide information about how dry conditions are affecting people. The effects of drought are different depending on where you are and what you're doing. Most of us in cities are well protected because professionals ensure that water comes out when we open the tap. But farmers and ranchers are some of the first to be affected by drought. Drought impacts can be slow onset, geographically dispersed, and diverse. So we look for drought impacts in a lot of places, including citizen science, news stories, and now social media. I started learning to scrape tweets in 2016 when the South Dakota state climatologist began sending examples of valuable information that first appeared on Twitter. And she continues to send good examples that have helped me add and refine search terms. One of the things we saw in 2017 was what seemed to be the organic or homegrown use of the hashtag Drought 2017, when farmers and ranchers in the plains took to the Twitter sphere to describe how fast emerging drought was affecting them. They started out sticking to hashtags like drought, drought 17, and NE drought, and have since evolved to use a broader set of search terms. Each time I add a search, I also end up paring it down to avoid some noise or running into a discussion like dust in a popular video game or something like that. And quite a few additional filters have evolved over the years to get rid of spammers, and sometimes people include very detailed references to how they would like to end their love droughts. I also use a set of filters that I first developed for news searches to try to cut search results down to in-state information so that we're not picking up a story about drought in California that appears all over the country. Now, each week I scrape Twitter for drought-related information and put it on an interactive map like this so that all the people who are providing local expertise to the US Drought Monitor can see what people in their state are saying about drought. And these maps are also publicly visible. I've also worked on this more analytically, contributing to the growing scholarly literature on using social media to detect hazards and impacts. I modeled the relationship between the number of tweets each week, each state, the population, news coverage of drought, and drought itself across 2017 and 2018, and also used a diversity statistic from ecology to tell us whether a greater variety of people than usual were tweeting about drought in the state. And this chart basically shows us that drought Twitter in Montana was more active than we would have expected for some weeks in the summer of 2017, which is a flag to go read the tweets and see what the conversation is about. One other thing I thought was really interesting was that when you take everything else into account, people in some states, especially the northern plains, tweet more about drought, and people in other states barely tweet about drought at all. We also found that states have different mixes of who is in the conversation, with the main group being farmers and ranchers, media, and climate and water professionals. So drought tweet maps are now one of the tools in the Drought Impacts Toolkit, and they're also a layer on the Drought Impacts multi-tool that lets users view several different layers of information about drought impacts on one map. I think next steps are probably to use machine learning and natural language processing to cast a wider net and to go deeper. We'd like to find a consistent way to identify original grassroots content and also just to distinguish the noise and chatter about drought from original reporting on drought impacts. And that's what I got. Thanks.
What you got is very cool, Kelly. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So some of these sessions are sort of there's sort of a theme. So we're sort of in a kind of a humans as sensors theme, as we went from talking about kind of threat assessment and security, and now we're talking about learning about drought and monitoring drought. Our next two presenters are also talking about kind of humans as sensors, I would say. Dr. Britt, Associate Professor of Advertising and PR and Associate Director of the Public Opinion Lab at the University of Alabama. And Dr. Matthew VanDyke, Assistant Professor of we call it AdPR, Advertising and Public Relations, and Director for the Office of Excellence in Science and Risk Communication Management at the University of Alabama. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Thank you very much for having us. And I see it as my job to get out of the way, set some context, and then let Dr. Britt have the floor, because he's going to talk about more interesting stuff that you all want to know about. So to set some context, we were very fortunate to get a Mississippi-Alabama Sea grant that was recently awarded for about $248,000. So over the next 2 years, we're going to be conducting this project, which really examines decision makers. So political leaders, emergency management personnel, et cetera, and public risk information behaviors during severe weather events along Mississippi and Alabama's Gulf Coast. So the first phase is what we're really here to talk about today, which is the social media stuff. And so the goal of this first piece is really formative research to characterize the landscape of public discussion around specific severe weather events along Mississippi and Alabama's Gulf Coast, and to understand how those conversations play out throughout the trajectory of specific weather events. This will be used to inform phase 2 interviews and focus groups with decision makers and the public, and also a phase 3 survey of a more representative, hopefully more representative sample of public risk information seeking and processing behaviors, and also hopefully identifying any discrepancies or perceived barriers to effective risk communication. And so for the social media piece of this, the theory that we're really relying on is the social amplification of risk framework, which really describes how risk information is disseminated and changed through social processes. One of the mechanisms is that risk information is disseminated through what they term amplification stations, where some information is amplified or receives greater attention, whereas other information is attenuated or dismissed. And so until recently, the role of interpersonal discussion as an amplification station has not been researched as much. And so we saw this as an opportunity to really look at how from the forecast of a severe weather event, such as a hurricane, throughout its trajectory, how does risk information and information in general about that event change over the trajectory of the event. So now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Dr. Britt, to talk operationally about what we're doing.
Sure. So for phase 1, the exploratory phase of our project, we'll be getting our data via Sprinkler, focusing on a retrospective data collection approach, looking at publicly available social media conversations about these sorts of severe weather events. Our query will be constructed in a very exploratory fashion, depending on how much data we actually have coming in. If you've done a search for the word COVID, you know just how many things can come in if you choose your search terms in a haphazard manner. So we're going to be looking just to see what the volume is coming in, as well as to ensure that we've got a relevant set of search terms for that. We'll also be focusing exclusively on posts made from Mississippi and Alabama Gulf Coast zip codes to ensure we're actually getting the population that we're interested in studying here. We'll then be using the software package Leximancer to conduct a computational content analysis. If you're familiar with inductive forms of content analysis, done open and axial coding, the concept maps that Leximancer produces are rather similar to this structure, the hierarchical structure of themes and topics that you would have at the end of that axial coding process. You can see an example concept map down in the bottom right corner here from a previous study. That's essentially what we're going to be getting at the end of that analysis. We considered using more sophisticated machine learning approaches like latent Dirichlet allocation or short text topic modeling techniques, but for the sake of this study, we wanted an approach that would be easily adapted adaptable by real world organizations that may not have the same level of computational expertise. So for a full on research study, we might do something like that. But for this, we decided to use more of an out of the box tool to assist with identifying those major themes in the conversation. Finally, we'll be using a technique called stepwise segmental regression to identify major shifts in the conversation based upon the longitudinal volume of posts being made. Stepwise segmental regression is a technique to identify breakpoints in longitudinal data. So we'll be using it very simply here to identify where the key peaks and valleys are and how much people are discussing these key points. And any periods between those breakpoints, we further probe using additional Lexomancer concept maps we'll be constructing for each individual period during the data set, so we can tangibly see how the conversation has changed over time in response to key events. So with that in mind, thank you very much for your time today, and we'll look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. This is a point where we can pause and ask questions. So let's see.
So there's still no questions in the question and answer box. Somebody should post one from the audience just to make sure that it's working, like, you know, just to do us a favor. But in the meantime, do we have any questions? Do people want to try raising their hands for questions? Or do we have any questions from the panelists? So Lance is asking, how did you find zip codes on the posts?
So I assume that was directed toward us. We've not done so yet because this is an upcoming study that we're going to be doing. I believe that we have the ability to filter that within Sprinklr platform itself.
Awesome. And panelists, you can unmute yourselves. So if you have a question, you can also unmute yourselves and ask. Attendees, if you raise your hand, I think I will see you and I can unmute you. Whoops. That was how that little, I don't know if you guys heard my phone go off. That just meant that Brian and Matt were really early done. Okay, so we have one in the question and answers. Can the panelists share if and what kind of IRB approvals required for your studies? If anybody wants to answer that so far.
I can at least speak for the rest of the grant. We'll have IRB for the interviews, focus groups, and for the survey. But where the data that we'll be accessing is publicly available, and Brian, you correct me if I'm wrong, we won't be engaging with our IRB for the social media piece. I'm very grateful for that too.
Whatever do you mean? I don't understand.
Right, well, we have a question from Melissa Lerner for Dr. Britt. What is the duration of your study? You mentioned that you'll be modeling social media attribute data over time.
Sure. So Matt, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's a 2-year period that we were looking at. Yes. And I forget the exact 2 years off the top of my head. I don't know why we didn't include that information. But yes, it is a 2-year period that we'll be looking at to see how the conversation evolved over time.
Terrific. Okay, well, Valerie, do you want to go on to the next 3 speakers?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a quick question of the panelists, which is how much defending or explaining do you have to do that Twitter data matters? So like Kelly, do you have to defend or explain why farmers and ranchers may be using Twitter and why that matters and is worth studying? And same for you, Brian and Matt.
I think that people who use data about field conditions that farmers and ranchers provide kind of take that as a starting point, and they always integrate it with a bigger data picture. So there's no, I think they'd like to get more one way or the other, whether it's Twitter, which might be convenient for some people if that's already how they're sharing information, or through citizen science or crowdsourcing. But it's never just one piece of information they look at. It's the whole context.
Okay, thanks.
So here's an, oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
No, please.
No, because I was going to switch topics. So
okay. So yes, for our work, it seems like the professionals generally understand that yes, social media is important. Where I've gotten the most pushback in the past has actually been from journal reviewers who don't recognize social media exists because they're not on it themselves. But generally speaking, if you provide a couple of figures saying, here's how many people are on these platforms, here's how many hours a day they're spending, if people are spending so much of their lives there, it's probably an important communication context. They generally get the point.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Thank you. Lisa,
So there's another open question, if you think we have time, Valerie.
Yeah.
Sierra asks, do any of the panelists tend to publish images of the social media posts they've analyzed to show examples that support their findings, conclusions? And if so, have they run into any ethical copyright issues here?
So I can speak for myself. I have not successfully done so. I have a study that I've been trying to get published at this point for a couple of years that involves sexual imagery on social media. And so you kind of have to provide that in some fashion. And that's a challenge to get published for a lot of reasons. I've had a number of conversations with editors who have said, really important topic. We want to make sure it's published, just not here. Find somewhere else. So that's a tricky thing depending on both copyright as well as just the nature of the themes within the content.
Thanks for that, Brian. I also wanted to point out a question in case people didn't see it that came up from Scout Calvert about protecting subjects even if IRB isn't required and so on. And I know this is something actually that we've talked about too, like is IRB keeping up with all possibilities or are we keeping up with it? And we did consider having a session on ethics during this workshop, and we kind of were stumped because I think we're still all trying to figure out ethics. So if anybody wants to, like the next workshop probably should go into that. So we're sticking with showing people how to, but also aware of the fact that we need to be thinking about why and how to do it correctly and so on. So
Can I add one thing?
Mhm.
The Twitter guidelines for developers is that you shouldn't, you have to kind of give people the opportunity to delete their stuff. So if you're going to share a data set made out of tweets, you just share the unique identifier for each tweet, the status ID, and then people can go and rehydrate it, they call it, where you add you see if that tweet is still visible. And if so, then you can access all the information. So my tweet maps, it took a while even to get comfortable with doing this, but we just link to the tweets. So you can click and link through to the content. And I think that's a pretty common practice for how a lot of journalists cite tweets. They embed it in their text without actually, sort of permanently republishing it.
And that sounds like it would help with some of the privacy things that Margaret also brought up. I wonder if we should go on to we can keep these questions open, especially the ones that come up about ethics, and go on to our next presenters, Valerie.
Perfect.